Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session, and it's really a huge privilege for me to be here. I'm Jo, and I work for the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. I'm going to take off where Chris actually left off and think about what I'd want as part of my Christmas and New Year wish list. And this is something that I've thought about a lot, given that I belong to a fairly new office, which was established last year when I joined the Green Climate Fund, called the Independent Evaluation Unit. This reports to the board of the GCF. And the main mandate of the office is really to think about what we can do to make GCF faster, smarter, better. So faster, smarter, better is basically what I think about all the time. Okay, and given the challenges of evidence and evaluation, well, evidence more so than anything else, we're constantly thinking about, well, what works? Whether it's private finance, whether it's public finance, whether it's policy, whether it's implementation, we're constantly thinking about that. There are a lot of challenges, as you know, when we think about evidence in climate change. And the ladies before me spoke and alluded to some of that. They spoke about impact investing. That is a huge challenge. Just knowing what is the total impact, and especially when you're trying to think about co-benefits, is a huge challenge. Challenges in climate change and production of evidence are really related in many, many ways. Impacts are too far, our discount factors are very high, we have complicated objectives, we have a complex environment, landscapes are complex, the environment is complex, climate change is complex. Given all of that, how do you think about impact, and how do you think about measuring it? Public good. Yeah, the public good and the tragedy of the commons is pretty well known. There are trade-offs. How do we think about trade-offs, and can we try and measure them? In many cases, especially with climate change and with assessments, a lot of these events occur suddenly. Can we think about what to do in the face of them, especially if we're not ready with evidence? What changes behavior? And how do we deal with probability? It's a challenge for me constantly within the fund, but also outside when we are thinking and trying to communicate probabilities. And last but not least, climate change and doing work in the environment, given that it is a public good, really has a large number, small payoff problem, right? And so in the context of that, what can we do better? And there are three things that I'm going to talk about today, and these are the three Bs: bias, benefits, and behavior. Yeah? So let's start with the first one, and this is bias. In a lot of evidence that we see, especially when we are thinking about what works for whom, why, and under what circumstances, there is a lot of bias. Bias comes in analysis, and biases come in interpretation. In analysis, you've got attrition bias, sampling bias, spillover bias, placement bias, et cetera, and we can talk about this. But really, when we are thinking about interpreting evidence, and that's really the big trick, yeah, there's availability bias. People only tend to look at what is available. There's anchoring bias. It really depends on where you're starting off from. In pieces of work that have been done previously, how you sequence your question. So if I ask you, are you happy? And your second question is, are you dating? Your responses are going to be highly uncorrelated. But if I reverse it and ask you, are you dating and are you happy, your responses are going to be extremely correlated, because people tend to think that happiness is correlated with your dating life. Yeah? So that's essentially the anchoring problem. And then, of course, you have confirmation bias. That is, you are looking constantly for evidence that seeks to confirm what you already think is true. And this is the problem with most evidence. I'll talk a little bit about this as we go along. Now, very quickly, and thinking about evidence, if I was to ask you, what are the 4 top things that you can do to individually reduce greenhouse gas emissions? I'm not going to ask you now, but, well, okay, any responses? What can you individually do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Eat less meat.
Eat less meat, very good. Anyone else? Not flying. So, yes, not flying, well, fewer children, living car-free, avoiding one transatlantic flight, we're doing very well there, consuming a plant-based diet. Yeah, these were the top 4 things that systematic review, over systematic review, have basically found are really good in reducing greenhouse gas emissions individually. And the amount of greenhouse gas emissions range from 29 tons per person per year for consuming a plant-based diet to 59 tons per person per year having fewer children. Yeah? And of course, again, this is for a group of countries, this was done in developed countries, etc. But the important thing is that many agencies don't think about what it is that can cause maximum impact. We all come from our starting points, and there's a bias there. We are path dependent depending on where we started off from. This is really important, especially for evidence and for evaluations, because in most of these, we don't talk about what is most effective. In fact, we constantly look at how we are doing things. So we are not asking the question, are we doing the right things? But we are asking the question, are we doing things right? And that's unfortunate because a lot of agencies, a lot of companies, a lot of individuals tend to be path dependent depending on where they're starting off from. Given all of that, I also quickly want to show you some evidence. So this is work that my co-authors and I did in 2016, and now we are updating it with our colleagues from C4, including Amy. Hi there. And we are looking at updating this work on, well, what works in land use change and what can we do? And we looked at area management techniques, we looked at law enforcement, we looked at incentives, and a whole lot of other things along an evidence gap map. We basically found that, yes, you could look at a lot of studies, and there are 221 studies that found their way into an evidence gap map. But guess what? Only 2 studies looked at cost effectiveness. And there were 0 studies that essentially took us from action and interventions on one side to measuring how much of greenhouse gas emission reduction it was leading to. There is bias in what we produce in terms of evidence as well. And we need to be cognizant of this. So, lesson 1, let's consider bias in how we produce evidence and how we use it as well. The second thing I really want to talk about are benefits. Yeah? And this relates to a whole lot of evidence, but I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I worked on and then some other work that others have done. So this is work that I did with co-authors, and we looked at road construction and whether it always led to deforestation. And again, confirmation bias, yeah, we could have very well concluded that, of course, road construction is going to lead to deforestation and then stop there. Except we worked through this and found a few things. Very precisely, a 10% reduction in agricultural costs that was caused by road construction led to reduction in upland rice area as well as increase in soybean. Overall, basically, what we found was that there was increased agricultural profitability and reduced deforestation. These kind of win-win options have been found in a lot of studies. So environmental and livelihood benefits are available and possible in many cases, except we don't sufficiently look at the magnitudes of these changes for us to know as to what's happening on the ground. It's really important to think about sizes of change when we are looking at our evidence. And we don't do that sufficiently. I'm going to also show you, and I think you may have seen this. This was a group of studies that was published that was undertaken by C4 and was published in PLOS One, which looked at the effective policies on forest cover compared across different spatial contexts. And basically the study found that the overall effects range from 0 to 0.5 percentage points of forest policies. Now, you might think this is very small. Actually, if you consider the cost that you have to put in, as well as the avoided deforestation beyond the time of intervention, these are fairly cost-effective interventions, except very few studies look at costs of interventions. So, my second takeaway is size is important. Let's measure effect sizes and costs, because we don't do that sufficiently currently. Okay. The third thing that I'd really like us to focus on is behavior, and ensuring that we measure the last mile, what works for the last mile. Yeah? We've seen a lot of science out there. A lot of science that tells us how to prevent obesity, how to reduce drug use, how to reduce alcoholism, smoking, etc. The thing is that clearly science is not enough, and we need to do more. And this is something where a lot of behavioral economics and behavioral science has started to make a dent, except we don't do enough of it in our own discipline. In environment, in climate change, we don't do sufficient amounts in this space. So, energy programs, recycling, tax collections, land use, insurance policies, programs, they all suffer from one common problem. So this crop insurance is especially something that, again, co-authors of mine and I looked at in a few years ago. And we found that in a lot of crop insurance programs, despite crop insurance programs and packages being actuarially fair, despite them being fair, the uptake of crop insurance among smallholder farmers was not more than 30% at a maximum. 30% was basically considered a success. Overarchingly, we found that this average rate of uptake was about 15 to 18% as part of our meta-analysis. This basically points to a last mile problem. Yes, we can have agencies that think about policies that put programs out there, but we have to do something about people changing their behavior so that they can start to think about making that small but critical change when we are thinking about climate change, the landscape, as well as environment. So, addressing the last mile, and this is excellent work now, of course. A lot of you are aware of work done by Kahneman, Tversky, Richard Taylor, Cass Sunstein, etc., is really pitting the cognitive versus context and changing the choice architecture. And we need to start thinking along those lines as we think about designing policies as well as delivering them. Okay. So this is an example that I like to cite, and this is work that was done by the University of Miami along with Imperial College. It basically helps to underscore for me that clearly science is not sufficient. Doctors know that they need to wash their hands before they go into a surgery room. A big study that was done in the 1990s found that in the United States alone, 100,000 deaths were caused because doctors just don't wash their hands going from one surgery room into the other. So clearly, it's not the science, because doctors of all people should know that not washing hands is going to lead to greater mortality or morbidity or both. Yeah? So it's something else. So what these researchers did is they said, okay, well, what can inspire them to change their behavior? And they ended up installing or experimenting with a hand sanitizer put at the entrance of surgery rooms. So that was essentially what constituted their control group. But then they also did a few other tweaks in the choice environment and found that if they could tweak the environment by putting, women's eyes, men's eyes, etc., to see whether that changed behavior. And this has been found now with loan programs as well. Bertrand et al. Looked at this in South Africa and found that putting a pretty girl's face on an advertisement that solicited people to apply for loans was equivalent to reducing interest rates by 30%. So, so here what the researchers did was that they looked at three things. They looked at men's eyes, then women's eyes, and then the third thing was they sprayed a lemon scent in front of the surgery door. Here are the results. So just installing this hand sanitizer in the control group led to a 15 percentage point increase in hand sanitizing behavior. Male eyes led to a 33% increase, which basically means over the control group, that was an 18 percentage point increase, right? Female eyes were not as effective. Women are not as effective in getting people to adhere to, or women's eyes were not. But what was interesting for me was that the olfactory nudge, so to speak, spraying a lemon scent nudged the brain of these doctors to think about cleaning the hands or applying some antiseptic solution to it before they went into surgery rooms. And this is over and above, so they saw 47% increase, and over the control group, that's a 32 percentage point increase. Yeah? So that's pretty big, and this sort of change in choice architecture is clearly something that we need to build upon and leverage as we go forward. This is a lot of work now that's been done across the world, and a lot of developed countries are thinking about it. Unfortunately, not so much in the developing world. Yeah? Behavioral science and the last mile problem. And here are a few more examples of it. When you compare, and this is work that's been done by the Behavioral Insights Unit, when you compare your energy usage with others living in the same neighborhood, people tend to reduce their own energy usage depending on how other people around them are behaving. They also looked at tax receipts. And they found, but most people are not malicious. It's not that they want to jump taxes. It's just that they forget. I forget to file my taxes. So a letter basically just saying that, look, people receiving this letter end up, 9 out of 10 people receiving this letter end up paying their taxes on time, increased tax receipts by 15% over the control group. Just that. And this is something, again, that hasn't been utilized enough when we're trying to mobilize finance from the public sector to contribute to things like a global good. Last couple of slides. Yeah, thanks. So a couple of things here that you may have heard of. The first thing is clearly changing the default helps to alter the choice architecture that we can and should be leveraging. And this is a classic case of organ donation in the United States. Priming, getting people to pick up smaller plates rather than larger plates makes them eat less, even if they're at a buffet. Yeah? Salience, so getting people to first deal with fresh fruit and then putting the donuts far away gets them to eat more fresh fruit. Yeah? And ego. So this is my favorite example. At Halloween, and these researchers basically looked at children's behavior at Halloween. When children in the treatment group were asked as to what their names and their addresses were, and both groups of children were told that they should only eat one piece of candy, the treatment group, where children had been asked their names and their addresses, were much more likely to eat one piece of candy compared to children whose names and addresses were not asked, because you were appealing to their ego. Just as an aside, children who also were facing candy boxes where there was a mirror placed at the back, where they could see their faces, also tended to eat much less candy. Yeah. So appealing to ego definitely changes behavior as well. So lesson 3, let's think about the last mile and what changes behavior. And that's my summary. Consider bias in how we produce and use evidence. Size matters. Let's measure effect sizes and costs. And think about the last mile and what changes behavior. And to end, much like the environment, happiness is a complex thing. Yeah? Many different things make us happy. But we know some things that make people happy. And there was a study that was done in 2003 that looked at one treatment group that was made to write down every day as to things that they are grateful for every day for a period of 10 days. And another group that was either told to recount the bad things that were happening every day or were left alone. Not surprisingly, people in the first group, in the treatment group, ended up being far happier just because they could recount as to the good things that were happening in their lives every day because they were grateful for it. Yeah? So choose to be grateful, and it will make you happier. With that, I'm grateful. And thank you so much for having me here.